What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to do another one of my top 10 videos, and today I'm going to try something a little different where I'm going to try and capture my top 10 favorite scenes or beats or moments in art, animation, and in live action that capture the spirit, the style, the tone, the flavor, the essence of J.R.R. Tolkien. And I feel like there's a lot of discussion right now about Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, and what's depressing to me about all these discussions, whether you're talking about written reviews or podcasts or YouTube videos, there are depressingly few videos about what makes J.R.R. Tolkien so special. What makes him unique? Why has he fascinated people for so many years? What is it about his literature that endures, where artists and animators and filmmakers and television writers keep trying to explore this world or capture this world? Because for my money, in the 20th century, I mean, there's so many legendary writers where you could make a case for them as a stronger literary voice, whether you're talking about Ernest Hemingway or F. Scott Fitzgerald or William Faulkner. But when it comes to my personal taste, J.R.R. Tolkien is sacred. The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion. And obviously there's bits and pieces and fragments that have been published since then, but that is kind of the essence of what he's all about. And they've been fascinating me my entire life. And there's a very real risk that I might just start weeping while doing this video, because I can't remember a time where I wasn't being emotionally impacted by J.R.R. Tolkien. Like, I saw the 1977 Rankin-Bass animated version of The Hobbit at a very young age. It just floored me. I was riveted. I was horrified. I was just completely, totally consumed. Then when I got a little older, my older brother became a massive fan of The Lord of the Rings. And like every kid brother out there, whatever your older brother's into, whether it's music or movies or whatever, that immediately kind of gets cool. He put a big giant Lord of the Rings poster on our wall, and I was just like, oh my God, like what is it about this world? I got to learn more. And then finally in high school and college, I got completely hooked. I mean, I would sit around for hours just poring over every little scrap of information about the Nazgul or Sauron or whatever the case might be. If I had ever applied myself to any of my academic pursuits with the same rigor as I applied myself to poring over like the appendices in The Lord of the Rings, maybe I would have been a much better student. And once you fall under the spell of this world, it permanently becomes a part of you. I spent my high school and college years in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, and I can vividly recall I'd be driving along on like 64 West through the mountains and get to a valley, and particularly this would happen during the fall when everything was, turning red, turning brown, where like the fall in the Blue Ridge Mountains is particularly beautiful. But I can remember I would, in my mind, be thinking, this is what the Valley of Rivendell would look like if it were a real place. I mean, I was just completely, totally obsessed. And I would just get chills remembering all the music from the animated Hobbit, because up until 2001, all we had really had were animated adaptations as well as like radio adaptations and that sort of thing. And so throughout my childhood, I'd do this thing where I'd create this little unofficial trilogy where I'd watch the Rankin-Bass Hobbit, and then I would watch Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated film of The Lord of the Rings, which does The Fellowship of the Ring and half of The Two Towers. And then I would throw in the Rankin-Bass Return of the King, which kind of sort of adapts Return of the King, but leaves a lot out. But that was the closest you could get to seeing like the full story, on the screen up until 2001 when Peter Jackson unleashed The Fellowship of the Ring. And I don't think you can overstate the importance of what Fellowship of the Ring did for the fantasy genre on the big screen. Just the cast, the sincerity with which they played those roles, whether you're talking about Ian McKellen bringing all that Shakespearean gravitas, or Christopher Lee, who's a massive Tolkien scholar who's basically correcting everybody on their pronunciation of all the language. And it was the first time in my life where I saw the fantasy genre showing massive appeal to people who didn't give a damn about the fantasy genre. And it was just this incredible otherworldly experience with a brilliant mix of practical and digital effects, where it allowed complete and total emotional investment for both the diehard readers as well as the completely casual fans. And I basically discovered online fan culture through that trilogy, whether you're talking about the trailers or the announcements or any news. And then those DVDs and those extended versions started coming out, which had all these incredible features and behind-the-scenes featurettes where you could just pore over the creation of those movies and just obsess over it And I feel like one of the best film schools you could possibly attend would just be studying the process by which that original trilogy was brought to the screen. And I was so preoccupied with that trilogy that inevitably I decided to finally read the Silmarillion. And my original copy of the Silmarillion I still have right here. It's kind of bruised and battered at this point, but I've read it several times. And I still think it's one of the best mythological fantasy texts that you could ever hope to come across. It's a very special book. And so while my interest in fantasy is not exclusively limited to the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, it's always kind of formed the spine of my interest, because throughout my childhood, I was seeing movies like Conan the Barbarian or Beastmaster, or I was playing games like Dragon's Lair at the arcade, or I was getting obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons. Like, I mean, there were so many ways to get into fantasy back in the 80s. And as an adult, I mean, I still read the works by authors like R. Scott Bakker or George R. R. Martin or Joe Abercrombie. I mean, the list goes on, or Robert Jordan, or old school people like Robert E. Howard. There are a lot of different doorways through which you can become obsessed with the fantasy genre. So if you were to look at the history of the fantasy genre over the last 100 years, I don't think you can make a case for any creator occupying a loftier position than J.R.R. Tolkien, no matter how many other incredible creators have been playing in that space. And so once again, this video is not meant to be a comprehensive look at all the adaptations of Tolkien ever and all the nooks and crannies. It's just the top 10 favorite beats, moments, images that really just get to the core of why I'm so obsessed with this world and the subsequent adaptations. So let me start with two honorable mentions that will not be making the list, but I didn't want to overlook the world of video games, because while the video games have a very unenviable task of trying to wrestle with the lore while at the same time creating an engaging gameplay experience, writing a novel and creating a video game, two very different mediums, two very different user experiences. But of all the games that I've played, two have really stood out. In 2006, I was completely floored by the real-time strategy game, The Lord of the Rings, The Battle for Middle-earth 2. I played it over and over and over, and I played it as good guys, and I played it as bad guys, and it's kind of hard to find these days. I would kill to go back and try it again. But the other ones that I really enjoyed, and they kind of played fast and loose with the lore, so it just shows I'm not a complete and total purist when it comes to the lore, but Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor from 2014 and Middle-earth Shadow of War from 2017, those games fucking rocked. And while you can definitely criticize it heavily for the way it tackles the lore and the character of Celebrimbor and the character of Sauron, etc. and so forth, but the tone, the atmosphere, and the gameplay were first rate. I have no idea how many hours I invested into those two games, but I don't regret a single solitary second. But enough delaying of the inevitable on my part. Let's get into the official top 10. So let's start with Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings from 1978. And Ralph Bakshi's style is not for everybody. He employs a lot of rotoscoping, which for me gives his animation a wonderful sense of fluidity, but for some people they just kind of find it eerie and strange to look at. And admittedly, this movie is very flawed, and this movie is only Fellowship of the Ring and half of the Two Towers, but it has a few things that work really well. First and foremost, a shout out to the awe-inspiring posters by Tom Jung, I'm not quite sure how his last name is pronounced, but a stunning artist. I mean, long before I saw this cartoon, I was just in awe of the poster art. But the one ingredient that I want to call attention to, that's my number 10, would be the tone of dread and anticipation down in the mines of Moria before the fight with the Balrog. If you go back and read that passage from Fellowship of the Ring, and then you watch the Peter Jackson film, and then you go back and watch this, there's just an incredible feeling where they find the tomb of Balin and they find the journal, and you really get this sense that they're about to be attacked at any second. And then this idea that there's something in there with the orcs that's more dangerous than the orcs. I just feel like in spite of all of its technical and budgetary limitations, Ralph Bakshi's film really nailed that scene, and so I've always been a big fan of that. And there are other ingredients that I like as well. I mean, I love the way the Nazgul are portrayed, and I love the way they move, but I couldn't make a top 10 list on that front without including at least one example from Ralph Bakshi's film. But for my number 9, let's get into the 1977 animated version of The Hobbit by Rankin and Bass. I could easily make a top 10 list like this just using scenes and moments from this cartoon. A contender for maybe the cartoon that I've seen the greatest number of times over any other. And there's just so much to love about it, from the portrayal of Gollum, or songs like Down, Down to Goblin Town, or the way that Smaug expresses himself and the way he's illustrated, or the farewell to Thorin at the end of the movie, or just the John Huston acting and voiceover. I mean, John Huston's one of my all-time favorite filmmakers, but he's also a brilliant character actor, as you can see in things like Chinatown. But pitch perfect casting as Gandalf. Long before Ian McKellen made the role his own, John Huston really nailed the character. And once again, Rankin and Bass, they employ an animated style here that doesn't work for everybody, but I think because I saw The Last Unicorn in the theater and The Hobbit on TV more or less at the same time, they just made a very strong early impression on me. I've always loved that animation style, but the part that I want to call attention to is the way this animated movie brings one particular poem to life, where the night that the dwarves and Gandalf are recruiting Bilbo and having him sign this elaborate contract, there's this beautiful scene with shadows on the wall as the dwarves are playing what's listed on the official soundtrack as Misty Mountains Cold, but the poem begins with Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold. But holy shit, that music is just bone-chilling. As I think Bilbo says, it just moves right through you, and then it transitions into this elaborate poetry as John Huston is reading all these lines over scenes depicting Smaug's attack on Lonely Mountain, all the treasures being created. But when I was a kid, I remember I was reading The Hobbit, and I would get to that poem, and I'd start imagining the music, and I would get goosebumps in my arms while reading the poetry, while imagining that melody. Anyway, very special stuff, and that might be the most Tolkien-esque moment in terms of flavor of any moment out of all the films or shows that I've ever seen. But for my number 8, let's get into some live action with a scene from The Two Towers from 2002, a movie that I might have looked forward more to this than any other movie in history in terms of just obsessively watching the trailers leading up to the release. Fellowship of the Ring had taken over the culture, and the trailers for Two Towers were just so goddamn good. And what was funny is how the first time I saw it, I was admittedly so fucked up and so stoned that I kind of couldn't even process it or understand it. But when I went back for a second viewing, I had so much fun watching it the second time that I went outside and immediately bought a ticket and watched it a second time back to back. I basically spent like 7 full hours at the movie theater that night. And the part that really gets me is the intro, when the camera is swooping in over all these snowy mountains, and we're hearing little echoes of the dialogue from down in Moria. And suddenly we're inside, and it's a flashback to Gandalf fighting the Balrog, and it all unfolds like we remember from Fellowship of the Ring, but then we get to follow him down into this endless pit. And the battle's cool as they're going down, but the part that I really love is how Glamdring is kind of like falling down the tunnel, and Ian McKellen just reaches out and snags the sword, and it has this cool little special effect, or this cool little sound effect, and he just starts beating the fuck out of the Balrog with that classic sword. Then I love how like the camera pulls back and we see them falling in the distance, and when they finally hit the water and they're thrashing and battling, and then we cut to Frodo waking up, and I was just like, holy shit, that is epic visual storytelling. And it's not a strict adaptation from the text. I mean, later on in The Two Towers in the novel, Gandalf describes to Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn what happened after they got separated. But that's a classic example of taking what's on the page and just really blowing it up and making it huge and epic and visual on the big screen. And it was just, yeah, I was sold from that point on with that flick. But from a number 7 on this list, I have to give a shout out to the screenplay adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring, written by Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Peter Jackson. And of all the scripts for all the Tolkien adaptations, I think this is my favorite screenplay, where not only did they make us believers and really nail the overall storytelling experience, if you know the text of The Fellowship of the Ring and then you watch this movie, what's incredible about it is how there's a lot of essential dialogue by Gandalf in an early chapter in the novel called The Shadow of the Past, where basically for page after page after page, just explaining what the threat of Sauron is to Frodo. But if you were to try to just put that scene in its entirety in the movie, I mean, we would have been sitting there for 3 hours with just Ian McKellen and Elijah Wood just hanging out by the fire talking about the ring. But what was brilliant about the screenplay adaptation is that they took that elaborate chapter, broke it up into a million little pieces, and took the best lines and sprinkled them throughout the movie as needed. Because that scene down in Moria when Elijah Wood first sees Gollum and he's starting to get kind of depressed about how dark a chapter of history that they're all living through, and Gandalf has to kind of bring him up, and he's talking to him about the times in which you live and like not being too eager to deal out death and judgment and so on and so forth. But all that great dialogue comes from basically the second chapter of the book of The Fellowship of the Ring. So once again, when it comes to a successful adaptation and story structure, I think the screenplay for Fellowship of the Ring is a thing of beauty. But for my number 6, let's give a little TLC to Return of the King from 2003, a movie which I saw 6 times in the theater. And I will admit, I wept openly during many of those screenings. And as I mentioned before, when it came to Jackson finding ways to kind of open up the text and make them epic and visual. I mean, cinema is the art of moving pictures. There's one sequence from this movie that, once again, it's like you take a few lines from the novel and turn it into one of the most memorable sequences of the entire trilogy when they are lighting the beacon in Minas Tirith, which sets off a chain reaction of beacons going all the way up to King Theoden up in Rohan. And it's almost like a little throwaway line in the novel, like, oh my God, the beacons are lit, like Gondor's calling for aid. But what they do with it in the movie, it becomes this soaring, euphoric sequence as the camera is just rising and rising and rising through the mountains, as you're seeing this chain reaction of different beacons being lit. And you're logically, your brain, if you allowed it to, would kind of reject it. Like, wait a second, there's a beacon at the top of a snowy mountain. Like, are people just up there year-round waiting to light this thing just in case? Like, how long have they been up there? But emotionally, it just works. And once again, my soul just soars during that entire sequence. But number 5, let's go back to Fellowship of the Ring. There are more great ingredients to celebrate and discuss than I can include in this video, but it's tough to deny the awe-inspiring power of that climactic final battle with the Uruk-hai, which more or less kind of bleeds in or bleeds over into text from the Two Towers. But it just shows how, when you're adapting these books into movies, being completely, totally faithful to every single line may or may not work, because I don't know of a single person out there who doesn't like the fact that the Uruk-hai were included in the climax to this movie to give it a final battle scene. But first and foremost, the Uruk-hai, the monster design, they look so fucking cool and so hardcore and just so jacked and so powerful. This might be the best action out of all 3 movies, where you're seeing Aragorn first by himself, just marching into a crowd of them and taking them on. Then, of course, Legolas and Gimli join in. And we get that incredible sequence with the redemption of Boromir. He has completely shamed himself by trying to steal the ring. And we get to see him doing everything in his power to try to save Pippin and Merry from being taken, and then ultimately getting taken out. I'm going to start crying even talking about it. But he did manage to redeem himself and keep his honor before he died. And what's so incredible about the scene is how the Fellowship has failed. They're broken apart. I mean, you've got Boromir dead. Gandalf is lost in Moria. Pippin and Merry have been taken. Frodo and Sam are going off to Moria by themselves. The Fellowship has failed. It's as bleak and dark of an ending as the ending of Empire Strikes Back. And yet, it still feels strangely optimistic as we see Frodo and Sam walking into Mordor. But at any rate, that climactic battle with the Uruk-hai, fantastic. And for my number 4, let's stick with Fellowship of the Ring, and let's go with the scene between the Balrog and Gandalf, where I think I've read that passage from that book more than any other passage from all the books. But there's some other contenders as well. But just to give people a reminder, here's how the Balrog is originally described in the text, where it reads, "It was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form, of man-shape maybe, yet greater, and a power and terror seemed to be in it and to go before it." And I know everybody loves the look of the Balrog, how it's almost like a volcano come to life, but I've always liked the idea of it being more a creature of shadow and darkness and smoke, one that gets kind of ignited during the face-off with Gandalf. And then to have the dialogue from the text just being, just ripped straight from the book, when he says, "I'm a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor, you cannot pass, the dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun, go back to the shadow, you cannot pass." And that's the text from the book. And if you want to get super nerdy, you can look up what Flame of Udun means. But this is the one, or I guess the first big hint in the text that Gandalf is wielding one of the 3 elven rings of power. When he says he's a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor, it's like, oh, you've got one of the 3 rings. And as we learn later on, it was Círdan the shipwright who gave it to him when he first arrived in Middle-earth. But in the end, it's Ian McKellen's awe-inspiring performance that really sells that scene, where he makes you believe. And there's a strong case to be made for Ian McKellen delivering the best performance in any fantasy movie ever. And there's some other contenders, but goddamn, he will always be in that conversation. But number 3, let's go to the scene that actually did make me cry in Return of the King in 2003. And I think Return of the King, of all the movies, is the most uneven, where the whole approach to the story is starting to change in terms of fewer practical effects, more heavy reliance on digital effects. Like if you look at Fellowship of the Ring and you see how many scenes there are where it's just like people on horses are walking through nature, whereas when you watch Return of the King, a lot of it feels like it was put together on a computer. That said, whether you're talking about the theatrical cut or the extended version, the scene that gets to me is when you hear the horn announcing that the riders of Rohan have arrived at the Battle of Minas Tirith, or the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and that they're there for reinforcements. And you see them riding up on that hill, and then King Theoden makes that incredible speech that's almost ripped word for word straight from the text. And I always had goosebumps the size of grapefruits on my arms, and I would just get completely, totally overwhelmed. And then when you hear Eowyn saying to Mary, like, courage, courage for our friends, it's so fucking powerful. The one knock of this scene in the extended version is that the extended version, they never quite nailed the interaction between Gandalf and the Witch King of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgul, which is one of my favorite scenes from the text. I mean, that scene, their face-off is just jaw-dropping, and it was kind of nailed in the Return of the King cartoon that Rankin and Bass did, but they removed that scene entirely from the theatrical cut, and you understand when you see how it's portrayed in the extended version, you can kind of understand why it hit the cutting room floor. But for me, it's like, how can you remove this essential scene between Gandalf and the Witch King of Angmar? In any event, when you hear that horn, it's pure magic. That might be the most epic moment on screen in any movie that I've seen in the 21st century, and I just love it to pieces. Now, for my number 2, I almost went with the original trailer for The Fellowship of the Ring, which was my first indication that this trilogy could end up being something really special, where they showed Galadriel talking to Frodo, and they gave us a brief moment where we got that iconic shot from Fellowship of the Ring where we see the Fellowship in their entirety walking together, and the music was very ominous. It wasn't the big, thrilling signature theme music that we got from the movie. But when I saw the 9 of them walking by, I was like, oh, whoa. Like, they might have gotten it. But for my number 2, I'm going to go with the moment where I realized that not only were these movies going to be good, but that they were going to be much better than my highest expectations, or better than I could have ever hoped. And that was during the sequence at the beginning of The Fellowship of the Ring, where Cate Blanchett starts describing the history of the Rings of Power, and then she goes into the last alliance of elves and men. And we see the Númenóreans and the elves marching into battle, and the camera sweeps up, and we see Mount Doom and just this ocean of monstrosities. And then when it started cutting to the close-ups of their faces, I can remember in the theaters being like, oh my fucking God, like Peter Jackson went for it. He's giving us real goddamn monsters. He has captured Mount Doom. Like, suddenly I realized not only was it going to be a good movie, that I was in really good hands, and that I was going to be able to allow my expectations to rise into the stratosphere for the rest of the trilogy. So that whole sequence when Elendil and Gil-galad and Elrond and everybody, when they encounter Sauron, that was the moment where I realized that Peter Jackson had somehow managed to do the impossible, and that these movies were going to be light years in ambition beyond Peter Jackson's earlier movies, because he'd already made Heavenly Creatures, which was incredible. He'd made Bad Taste, which was, kind of fun, schlocky insanity. And he'd made Meet the Feebles, and he'd made Brain Dead, a.k.a. Dead Alive. I mean, he'd made some really cool stuff. But suddenly, The Fellowship of the Ring, like, wow, like, all your life has been leading up to this moment, and you've delivered. But for my number 1, I'm going to go with an outside choice, but it'll make sense once I elaborate. But I'm going to go with the art of Alan Lee and the art of John Howe. And for people who don't know, Alan Lee and John Howe, they were the lead concept artists on the Lord of the Rings films, but they'd already established themselves as the 2 most prominent illustrators of the world of Tolkien in previous publications of the books and collections of art, etc. and so forth. But as great as the production design is, and the costume design, and just the overall flavor of this trilogy of movies is, so much of that stems directly from the original paintings that were created by these guys long before these movies ever got the green light. And I remember there was one great passage in the behind-the-scenes documentaries where Peter Jackson was joking about how he finally was going to get a chance to see what was at the top of Saruman's tower, because Alan Lee had done this incredible painting, but it was only like halfway up. So they basically took the exact same design from the painting and just finished it. Or the scene where Alan Lee portrays Gandalf and Frodo sitting by the fire during the Shadows of the Past chapter. I mean, it's just beautiful, wonderful stuff. And Alan Lee might be the better artist, but where John Howe has an advantage for me is that he's invested a lot more time in capturing signature scenes and moments from the Silmarillion. And in subsequent publications of like The Children of Húrin and things like that, where Christopher Tolkien expanded sections of the Silmarillion into standalone novels, Alan Lee did get to flesh out that period. But the way that John Howe captured the fall of Gondolin, long before I read about the fall of Gondolin, I saw this art. I was like, what the fuck? And that's one of the reasons I actually ever even read the Silmarillion, when I saw that there were dragons and Balrogs, plural, involved in that battle, and that somehow there was like this chapter of elven history that I was totally unaware of, or basically gotten fragments and references to in songs and poems in The Lord of the Rings. But as soon as I saw that, I was like, I need to read fucking more about this. And since then, he's done so many amazing paintings, whether it's paintings of Morgoth or whatever the case might be. But goddamn, John Howe has really done some really special work on this front. So if any of these paintings by Howe spark and excite your imagination, take the baton and run with it and read the Silmarillion. So regrettably, we've reached the end of my list, and there are easily 100 other beats that could have made this list, like whether you're talking about Sean Astin having his great Rudy moment at the end of Return of the King, where he's like, I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. Come on, and picking up Frodo. Or the music Into the West at the end of Return of the King. Or the closing song in Two Towers, where you see Gollum leading Frodo and Sam. He's like, oh, follow me. And that music was so eerie and so beautiful. It just is bone-chilling. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Or just little things like when Sean Bean whispers behind Gandalf, what is this new devilry? As you get like the hint and the suggestion of the Balrog as it's walking through Khazad-dûm. These stories are an absolute cornucopia or an embarrassment of riches when it comes to incredible beats. But these are my favorite moments so far in art, animation, film, and television that capture the world of Tolkien. And I don't know if this new show will have any scenes that make contributions to this list. I mean, if you've noticed, I didn't include a single scene from the Hobbit trilogy. I admire what they tried to do, but that should have been one movie based on one book. Stretching it into a trilogy, I think, was a critical mistake that just, anyway, I'm not going to get sidetracked on that for now, but hope y'all enjoyed this video. But before I close things up, we got to do a little bit of advertising. So if you haven't heard already, it's Smooth Sack Summer. When you're playing in the summer sun, at least for the next few weeks, make sure you're escaped from pubes to bum. That's right, this is the summer to keep your balls cool while still looking hot with Manscaped. Still hot as hell in New York, so this ad absolutely still applies. But the leader in below the belt grooming is making sure we all have a ball this summer by giving our pants partners everything they need to stay fresh. Dive headfirst into Smooth Sack Summer by going to manscaped.com for 20% off and free shipping with our code WrongReel. That is WrongReel in all caps. WrongReel's my podcast. If you have not yet heard my podcast, Wrong Reel, go have a look. We've got like well over 600 episodes with deep dives into film history on all kinds of topics. But if you're not yet convinced about Manscaped, I'll give a brief review from one of my brothers who was 20, where he just said, after he took all the products for a test drive, he said, dude, that was the hype. So please consider buying a package from Manscaped if you want to support this YouTube channel or my podcast. But remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and give me a shout on Twitter if you want to talk more about J.R.R. Tolkien. But I can't thank you enough for watching, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.